The rumors were, of course, true. In recent months, Donald had been relegated to the back of the now run-down Arlesborough sheds. It had 4 berths. The second was occupied by Duck, who still went out now and then, and the 4th had always been empty for as long as both Donald and Duck had been there. Donald knew it would have been his brother's. He tried not to look over there. To imagine his brother's ghost looking back, that was hard. The 3rd berth, though, belonged to Oliver. But Oliver was gone now, and had ruthlessly been sacrificed so his parts could be used to repair Thomas, who had become priority in the heat of the island's downfall. Donald still felt a sting of betrayal at the thought. He had rescued Oliver from scrap, and the act had helped to heal the jagged wound left behind by his twin's loss. Now, the very people who had torn him away from his brother had taken away his best friend, too. And for what? To try and keep a dying beast alive? Sodor was finished, and Donald knew it. So did Duck. The island had been pristine once, with only the most necessary railway lines cutting across it, and only a few engines to run them. Hell, when Donald had first arrived there, had only been a little over a dozen engines on the whole island, including the Scarlowy and Coley Fell lines. Now, the sprawling hills were crisscrossed by seemingly pointless tracks, and there were more engines on the island than the whole of England could ever have any hope of knowing what to do with. Many people were moving away, for the simple reason that the island was no longer the idyllic place it once was, leaving the maze of rail lines and facilities unmanned and the surplus of engines without crews. It hadn't always been that way. Once, new engines would come because they were needed. Even Oliver, whose arrival hadn't been planned by anyone other than the engine himself, had come at a time when they had needed the help. Somewhere along the line, though, that had changed. For every one job opening, 2 or 3 engines would arrive, or sometimes engines would turn up. For every one job opening, 2 or 3 engines would arrive, or sometimes engines would turn up when there were no job openings at all. Sometimes temporary engines would become permanent, even though they weren't needed, and at some point there were more engines than trains that needed taking. Some of the engines were completely useless too, Donald thought, referring to the more recent additions. But then, perhaps, the most glaring problem of all was that engines seldom, if ever, left the island. Come couldn't exist without go, thought Donald, in the same way that go couldn't exist without come. In other words, the island was bursting at its seams. Donald knew what it all boiled down to. The Hat family had a problem. It had started out innocently enough. They had wanted to save a dying race, the steam engines that the mainland no longer found useful. They had been commended for it, even as Donald had turned a blind eye and spat insults about them when he and the western engines were alone in the shed. He couldn't forgive them for his brother's loss, and perhaps that was what had, after a while, allowed him to see what the others did not. They were hoarding. Donald? Duck's voice broke through his thoughts, and he looked over to where the pannier tank's form was shrouded in shadow. "What are you thinking about?" the green engine went on. "Your thoughts are so loud I can almost hear them." Donald made a sound that Duck considered a variant of what he had long ago dubbed Scottish noises. "Och, you know, just about how we're all screwed thanks to the hats." Duck rolled his eyes. "That's not true, Donald. They've dug themselves a hole, but they'll get out of it," he said hopefully. "You forget that they saved you." Donald scoffed. "Och, aye, saved me fine, but didn't bat an eye for my brother. I'd have rather died with him than be stuck here for all eternity. Duck frowned. You know they didn't have enough money at the time to buy both of you. But they had enough to buy all those other wastes of space, Donald muttered back. What, like me? Duck snapped. Gee, thanks, Donald. No, Duck, Donald settled a bit. Not you. You're a good sort. I mean, that good-for-nothing Billy? Duck suggested cheekily. Hi! Or that wee prat Charlie, or whiny red scrap iron. Duck raised an eyebrow. You mean James? Hi, Donald affirmed. He's too much of a bairn to take a few trucks without complaining. My brother would have been more use than any of them combined. Christ, he went on, if they ever try to cut me up to save some useless idiot, I'll run myself off a cliff before they can. Well, said Duck, I can't blame you there. Time went on then, as time always does. Somewhere out on the island, a little engine cried as his brother was cut up so his parts could be used to repair him. A big engine argued in vain as his express was handed over to a diesel, and an old engine was sheeted and left in his shed for the last time. 2 railways, one very small and the other very tall, were shut down. More people left the island, and Donald and Duck's shed struck a leak in the roof. This is just great, Donald said crossly as water dripped onto his boiler from above. I'll rust. Dinna fash, Donald replied. You can switch berths next time you go out. If I go out again, Duck huffed. They looked at the shed doors longingly. Aye, Donald said quietly, if. And then something happened. One day, news came to the shed. Donald had been bought and was being sent back to Scotland with his crew. He didn't know how to feel about the matter. He'd been given another chance, but a part of him wished he'd just been scrapped and put out of his misery. He would be with his brother again then, on the rails in the sky. But that was not the case, and soon the day arrived that he was to leave. His fire had been lit for the first time in a long while, and the shed was warm and clammy with steam. He was ready to go. Well, old boy, are you ready? The driver asked. Donald responded simply, Aye. Goodbye, Duck. Goodbye, Duck replied sadly. Good luck and travel safely. Donald eased out of the shed towards the turntable. He paused just before his friend left his line of vision. I'm sorry I can't take you with me, he said regretfully. I'll be fine, Donald, I promise, Duck replied, but Donald could hear the fear in his voice. We both ken that's no true. Duck blinked back tears. So did Donald. Even so, it was nice knowing you, Donald. Aye, and you, Donald replied. I couldn't have made it here without you. Goodbye. Goodbye. With that, Donald steamed over the turntable and out of the yard, losing sight of Duck for the final time. A tear ran down his cheek and dripped onto his running board as he crossed the Vickerstown Bridge, not for the island, but for the last friend he had no choice but to leave behind. Their journey took them north, to Glasgow. Luckily, they were able to hitch a ride up on the back of a friendly diesel's train, so they weren't in danger of running out of coal. Donald grumbled about it, of course, finding it embarrassing to be dragged around by a dirty diesel, like he was some invalid. However, the diesel took no notice as they parted ways at the station. Have a good rest of your trip, it called, as it rumbled off to find its next train. Donald grumbled a half-hearted reply as his fireman stoked up his fire again. Soon they set off again, diverting onto the West Highland line. It took another few hours before they arrived in Oban. and then he was loaded onto a ship. He had never been on a ship before, but he found it mesmerizing. It was a part of the world that he, as a railway engine, had only ever seen from the rails of seaside stations and harbours, and he couldn't stop staring. The water glistened like diamonds in the rare Highland sun, and the ocean was full of islands, hazy dark outlines scattered like shattered glass all up and down the coast. The sound of the waves against the hull of the boat lulled him, and he slept for a while. He dreamt of thick fog and a whistle, deep-toned and familiar. He woke to a bump as the ship docked. Soon, he was unloaded via a rickety crane into a small dockyard. His crew came back to him then and fired him up as he looked around. It was a small island, windswept and rocky, with a single railway line disappearing away from the docks. "And you must be Donald," a voice interrupted his inspection of his new surroundings. He looked down and saw a tall man with red hair and blue eyes in front of him. "Aye, sir." "Good. I am your new manager," he said. "Feel Gaelic it?" Donald blinked in surprise. He hardly ever met a human who spoke Gaelic. It was, however, common among Scottish-built engines, for some unknown reason. He hadn't used it since before Sodor, and it felt so good to hear it again. "Aye, I do." The man looked pleased. "Live Felcha, Donald." Donald smiled, despite himself. "Tapa leave." The man continued in English. "You'll get on fine with my other engines then. Sometimes it seems their favourite pastime is speaking Gaelic just to annoy the workmen who didn't understand it." Donald smirked a bit. He had done that himself on Sodor in the early days, just to piss off the clueless English workmen. "Maybe I will." "How many engines do you have, sir?" "There are two," he replied. "A narrow-gauge industrial well tank called Duncan, and a CR-652 called Douglas. The latter is at the top of the line now. You can leave when you're ready. I'm sure he'd like to see you." But Donald suddenly felt cold to the boiler. He didn't recognize either of the names, but he missed how his new manager had said see instead of meat, and he didn't want to have to share a shed with one of his other brothers, one who wasn't his twin. "Aye, sir," he said, colder than he meant to. They filled up on coal and water and left soon after that, up the singular line that cut across the island. However, when he reached the aforementioned top station, the only other engine in sight was a small one he presumed to be Duncan. Looking around, he spotted a double shed off to the side. One berth was closed, the other was open and empty. Noting that there wasn't really anywhere else for a standard gauge engine to go, he figured Douglas must have been in the closed berth. He was about to head over there, however, reluctantly, when Duncan interrupted him. "Why, newbie." Donald rolled his eyes and answered, "Aye, grab those trucks there, the full ones, and take 'em down to the harbour." He sighed. "Oh, very well," he said, and set about getting turned around before backing down on the trucks in question. They were sitting beside a platform that separated them from a line of narrow-gauge trucks, from which they'd clearly just been loaded. Soon, he was on his way back down the line, with his trucks in tow. Privately, he decided he'd rather be working than sitting in a shed anyway. He'd been doing far too much of that lately. So then he spent the rest of the afternoon running up and down the line, apparently filling in for Douglas, who was mysteriously absent. It was a while in before he realized he was enjoying himself. The island was peaceful, unlike the constant bustle of Sodor before things had taken a turn, and it reminded him a bit of Harwick, that distant, windswept village in the north, where the NWR officially ended. It was all rocky cliffs and deep water, and a small harbour that sat below the town itself. Maybe he could be okay here, he thought. This idea dissipated as soon as he pulled, whistling, into the next station. Coaches slid easily to a stop behind him, and people went about getting in and out. He waited. "Daddy, look!" a small child exclaimed, somewhere nearby. Douglas has new paint! Donald followed the sound of the voice with his eyes and spotted a father-son duo looking back. "So he does," the father replied. "Pity, I quite like the blue." They walked over to him then, and the father spoke. "Fresh paint, eh, Douglas? I heard there was a new engine arriving today. Have you met it yet?" Donald glanced away awkwardly and then looked back. Actually, sir, I am the new engine. My name is Donald." The man stared at him for a moment and then laughed. "That's a good one, Douglas. You and Duncan come up with that?" "No," said Donald, blinking confusedly back. The man just chuckled as he walked away, leaving Donald's boiler feeling cold as he pulled away. He hadn't been mistaken for another engine since before Sodor. But no. His twin was dead, scrapped. This mysterious other engine couldn't be him. It must have just been that the two of them were of the same class that had led him to being mistaken. Nothing more. He would not hope for something that could not be. Meanwhile, Douglas was dozing peacefully in his shed. It was his day off, or rather his crew's day off, and by extension his. Generally, when Douglas wasn't running, the bus would manage the passengers. But on this day, there was rather more activity going on at the train station than usual. Douglas knew this must have been because the new engine was arriving today. Or so he'd been told. Setting that line of thought aside for later consideration, he dozed again. But this time he was disturbed. Fitful dreams of an island shrouded in fog, and the deep wail of a familiar whistle. He woke with a start, inadvertently bumping against the buffers behind him. The whistle came again, though by now he was wide awake. He could hear puffing sounds and two engine voices conversing. One was Duncan's distinct burr. The other was also familiar, but in a way that nothing else ever could be. Canopy, Sodor. He looked frantically out the open door of the neighbouring berth, but could not see the station from that vantage, only the rocky green hills of the island. His own door was shut, as it had been raining earlier, and so he could do nothing but sit, mind racing. The last run of the day was a goods train from Duncan's mine due at the docks. After that, he was able to run light engine back up the line to the shed. He chewed his lip anxiously as he went. He didn't want to meet the other engine, this other brother of his. He could scarcely bear the idea of having to share a shed with a brother that wasn't his twin. He whistled absently through the station, second to top, mind flickering through vague memories of his beloved lost twin. The top station was in sight then, and there was a sudden shuffling in his cab. He could hear his crew whispering to each other in the Gaelic, a language they had actually learnt from him, too low for him to make out the words. Instead, he focused ahead. The station was empty save for a few straggling workmen, and Duncan, nowhere in sight, must have vacated as well, in favour of his own shed. Speaking of sheds, his eyes glided over to his from the station. The door, which had been closed previously, was open now, and he froze, his wheels skidding as he slammed on his brakes of his own accord. Screeching to a halt, he stood still before the station, black eyes wide and face white, as if he'd seen a ghost. The engine in the shed looked back, wide, wet eyes glinting in the glow of the spotlight shining above him. They stood frozen for several minutes, Donald trembling as tears coursed down his cheeks. When it became apparent that he wasn't going to move himself, his driver eased open the regulator again and drove him over to the turntable in front of the shed. Donald let him, his mind in a haze of disbelief and heartbreak. He was seeing a ghost, surely, or dreaming, or sex. The voice sent tremors through his frames, and he sobbed hard, squeezing his eyes shut. You're no really here. I'm dreaming. You're scrapped. Now no but a ghost haunting me. The other engine, it wasn't 7, it couldn't be 7, moved forward as much as he could with no steam. I was saved, or rather, bought and brought here, to this wee island. Donald refused to believe. No. I've had this dream before. I'll wake up and you'll be gone. The other engine chuckled. I'm no going anywhere, Six. And sure as hell no now that you're here, he said, and rolled forward so their buffers touched. Donald sobbed. It's really you, then? Here and living? Aye, I was so worried when I heard what was happening on Sodor. Manager saw I was upset about something and asked. I told him, but I didn't think he'd do this, Douglas explained. Aye, Donald echoed. He must really like you if he was willing to buy me and bring me to this wee island. There's hardly room for 1 engine here, let alone 2. Douglas laughed as Donald backed into the empty berth beside him. There's more to do here than you might think, to look at it. Manager said the line used to run all the way up to the harbor on the north coast. The whole thing was completely shut down for years before I came here. The war, I think, did it in. Manager reopened it, and he wants to reopen the rest someday too. If he does that, we'll both be set in Duncan as well. Donald looked skeptical, though. Aye, so long as he doesn't replace us with diesels. You didn't have to worry about that, Six, Douglas assured. He's a staunch preservationist, and this line is an official heritage railway. We are safe here. That, then, was all Donald needed to hear. He broke down in tears again, with the relief of it, and didn't settle until after his crew had quietly slipped away. It was some time before either of them spoke again. He said, He called you Douglas. He gave you a name? Donald asked, moving on to a new, less emotional subject. Douglas looked over at him with a smile. Aye, he did, and you can have one too. His brother smiled back. I have a name. They gave me one on Sodor. 'Tis Donald. Douglas raised an eyebrow. They match. That's a wee bit strange, considering. Donald and Douglas. Aye, they do. That's fitting, us being twins and all, Donald agreed. Donald and Douglas lived happily then, reunited as they were on the small island railway. Donald was eventually repainted into Caledonian-lined blue to match his brother, and he occasionally thought of Duck, wondering whether he'd lived or died. Was he still on Sodor, shut up in the shed they'd shared, left to rot with it? Or had he been scrapped? Donald hoped he'd been sold and was safe on a heritage railway somewhere, but he knew that was wishful thinking. Not all engines could be saved. Donald didn't want to remember Sodor, those years spent believing his twin brother dead and trapped unwillingly on a railway run by a man who could never have enough. He couldn't help but remember it, though. Couldn't help but remember Doc and Oliver, and when he thought of them, he couldn't help but shed tears for them. They were the only ones there who he divulged more than just his name and number to, the only ones who knew about Douglas. They had made his life there bearable, and reminded him, when he wanted nothing more to do with living, that oughtn't he make the most of his life for Douglas, for every other engine who'd been lost to the scrappers? Now, Douglas was alive and safe against the odds, and it was Duck and Oliver who were gone. Donald remembered their words to him then, and put them to good use. He pulled his trains to the best of his ability, doing his part well to keep the railway in good working order. When the northern branch was reopened, he took it over and ran it like clockwork. The little island railway prospered. Engines thrived with it.